Okay, we're recording. Okay, hello everyone. This is ACM Cyber's Red Team panel. I am your host, Asher. And today we have a very special guest. He's a very interesting man, and I've talked a little bit with him before. And can you introduce yourself?
So I'm Mike Rogers. I am the Red Team Technical Lead at Viasat. I also do some freelance consulting work at a cybersecurity startup called Fortified Logic, and I teach the intrusion detection and penetration testing courses at Cal State San Marcos online.
Oh, okay. So for this panel, what is your description of red teaming? What is this red teaming stuff?
There are a lot of descriptions of red teaming going around. The one I like the most, not necessarily the most accurate, but the one that I found resonated the best with me was red teaming is what happens when somebody walks into a security budget discussion and is told, prove it. So
Okay.
to be more precise, especially to those who have never heard the term red teaming before, red teaming and blue teaming goes back to the military when op forces would do war games, and the blue team was the defensive team, and the red team was on the attack, the offensive team. And when things started going more and more online and computers became more ubiquitous, this moved into the world of cybersecurity as well, with the red team being enemy hackers and the blue team being the system defenders. And this has spilled over into the professional civilian cybersecurity world, where red teaming is very much the offensive side of cybersecurity. We use actual techniques by known hacking groups and APTs. We use exploits. We do most of the same things actual malicious hackers would do, only we're doing it specifically to inform business risk and to make sure that the people who will hold your systems for ransom or burn your network to the ground can't get in the same way we got in.
Okay, so we hear this term pen testing going around sometimes. Like, what is this? What is pen testing?
Okay, so a lot of times you reach for a pen, and you go to write, and just scratches on the paper, and there's no ink. So we make sure that your pen always has ink. We test the pens. So
wow, that's great.
Seriously though, pen testing is short for penetration testing, and it is most of what offensive security experts do, and that is we try to penetrate into systems or networks using exploits, social engineering, trying to trick people out of passwords or to get people to let us in, click on links. We use software exploits, password crackers, brute force tools. We try to see how far into a network we can penetrate and then give the system owners a report on what we did, how we did it, and how we recommend they make it so we couldn't do that again.
Okay, so how did you get your start with red teaming? What made you decide to go into it?
Okay, so story of my life, and I mean that only very slightly sarcastically. When I went from high school to college, I had no idea what I wanted to do for a career. My thought process was basically something computer, something profit. So I flipped a coin, applied to some schools as an electrical engineering major, some schools as a CS major. I ended up actually going to UC San Diego for my undergrad as an electrical engineering major, and I took most of my technical electives through CS, which ended up giving me a very good idea of low-level software techniques, the hardware software interface, a lot of the places where security tends to break down. And towards the end of my career at UC San Diego, towards the end of my degree program, one of my electives was the computer security class. And I actually fell in love with computer security in like my last semester as an undergrad, which was a little unfortunate. But I had all of grad school the first time to make it up. So I went from UC San Diego to University of Illinois, still as an electrical engineering major, but again, I was taking most of my electives through CS. I did some machine learning, some control systems, and a lot of cybersecurity. I ended up TAing for the undergrad cybersecurity lab, setting up a capture the flag exercise for their capstone project. I took and then TA'd a malware reverse engineering class. And the big break I really got was my junior, I can't really say junior year as in a grad program, but third or fourth year, I ended up getting an internship with Salesforce on their red team. They have an internal red team that they use to maintain their own internal security without having to hire out or contract out to a third party. And they taught me the basics. They put me through OSCP certification training, which is a very high level, very sought after red teaming certification. And with that and my master's, I went to a few career expos, ended up talking to some people from Viasat, and ended up working for them on their red team.
Ooh. So what do you find yourself doing at your job as a red teamer?
Okay, so here's the thing about red teaming. Unless that is your actual business focus, it's not something you do every day. So there are consulting firms that will do red teaming for a bunch of clients all at once, and that's all they do 24/7, red team, red team, red team. But Viasat is a telecommunications company, a satellite internet provider. We have an internal red team, which I am the technical lead of, and we do a lot of pen testing against our internal products, our systems and services, things that we're going to sell that we want to make sure don't get us on CNN as thousands of routers hacked last night. But we don't really have enough to support full-time red teaming. And that's one of the reasons I teach the incident response class, in addition to the pen testing class at Cal State San Marcos, is I find myself dancing on both sides of the fence. I do some blue teaming work. I work with our SOC on tuning our incident response techniques, our network monitoring techniques. I'll help make sure that certain government contracts are government compliant. So the government issues giant checklists of things that you have to be compliant with before they'll let you put your system on a government network. And I help make sure that that's being taken care of. I help mentor some of our newer red team members. A little bit of a lot of things, actually.
Wow, so man of very many talents. So what do you think is the best part about it, your job?
It's probably not politic to say the look on my client's face when I tell them I rooted their domain controller, but I'd be lying if I said that wasn't way up there on my gleeful moments at work list. But in general, whenever I get an exploit to work is always a fun moment.
It's like, oh, what do you love the best about your job? The shock and shock and horror looks on people's faces when I tell them, yo, I have access to all your personal identifying information, social security, bank account number, you name it.
I mean, you laugh, but there was one job a few months ago. The company we were pen testing, and naturally, I'm not naming names, but one of their employees in accounting decided that the best way to keep track of all of their accounts was to have all of their bank account numbers, routing numbers, daily transfer limits, bank usernames, passwords, all of it in an unprotected Excel spreadsheet on a network shared drive.
So how would you suggest that you make this more secure? Like what's the hardest way for this to be hacked? Like how would you separate the information or sort it or section it off?
So one of the things that we advise most going in is defense in depth. It's not enough to have a good perimeter, because somehow, sooner or later, somebody's going to get through it. Somebody's going to click on a link they shouldn't. Somebody's going to answer a phone call and say, yeah, my password is password 123. No defense is absolute. So once you've got your firewall set up disk encryption. Once you've got your disk encryption set up, have passwords on individual files if they have sensitive data. If you don't have to store the original form of it, store it encrypted, store a cryptographic hash of it. Do everything you can to trip up an attacker, because any one item can fail, but going through 10 different security protocols in a row is a lot harder.
Okay, so what's the most difficult or challenging part about your job? Or is there anything in particular that, okay, like maybe I don't like this part of the job, but everything else is great?
Okay, I'm definitely not a fan of reporting. And when I teach the pen testing class, I tell my students, you can have as much fun as you want breaking into systems, running exploits. Go nuts. That's part of your job. That's the fun part of your job. But remember, your job isn't break into the system. Your job is make sure no one else can break into the system. So not only do you get to have your fun, you also have to write a good report on it that explains exactly what you did and how to fix it, because that's your actual deliverable. That's what you're getting paid for. But anybody who's ever written a paper or a report can tell you it is painfully boring sometimes, especially if you're coming off the high of, yeah, I popped that domain controller in about an hour and a half.
So for these reports, right, because I'm a student, and so I've only written, like school reports. How does this differ in the industry? Are the reports basically like how are they different? Are they the same? Is it like writing an
Um,
essay?
yes and no. Some of the same things carry over. You might have references. You definitely have to come across as professional with good spelling, good grammar, good organization. But if you're writing a school paper, it's usually a research paper. You're reading other papers, you're summarizing them, you're pulling out metadata from them, you're producing something new based on other people's research. Here, you're basically writing a report saying, here's how I owned you, which sounds like it should be fun, except this is your client you're talking to. And as much as you might want to brag, you kind of also want repeat business. So you can't be insulting or, oh, yeah, your security sucked. You should say, we found some suboptimal configurations you may want to consider addressing. You, it, that's really one of the hardest things is phrasing it as, your security sucks, but I can't say your security sucks. So here's 3 pages to make you feel good before I say your security isn't the best.
Okay, so that's the most challenging part, just saying, okay, you know what? You don't know what you're doing. And find some way to tell them, hey, yeah, it's not it. Okay.
I mean,
So
to give one example, one company we pen tested, we found an employee whose password was fish, and I mean lowercase f, lowercase I, lowercase s, lowercase h, 4 lowercase characters. Fish. That was his password.
I I would never
I
have
had
guessed
to
it.
I had to rewrite that paragraph 5 times before I could go from have you ever heard of a password policy to you may want to consider implementing a stronger password policy. Current recommended standards are 14 characters, uppercase, lowercase, numerical characters, special characters. Like that, there are days you just cannot get your face out of your hand for how bad some of these people's security is.
Okay. Okay, so in terms of expectations, how did your expectations of, let's say, cybersecurity or your work differ from the reality of actually just doing it and experiencing it?
So, not gonna lie, I was hired as a pen tester. I was expecting to do mainly pen testing. And I do a fair bit of pen testing, but I was not quite expecting to be thrown onto all of these other projects, which, I don't regret it. It's not my main interest, but one of the reasons I like teaching both a blue teaming class with incident response and a red teaming class with pen testing is the tricks you pick up from one side of the street can help you a lot on the other. If you're going into blue teaming, if you want to be a SOC analyst or a CISO or somebody who sets security policy, having a good working knowledge of what a pen tester does and how we do it is really valuable for what should be your chief concern: password policy, updates, it helps. And similarly, as a pen tester, knowing that, okay, this is how most network traffic logs work, I have a better idea of how to circumvent those and make sure that I don't show up in the logs when I'm trying to exploit a system.
Do you,
So,
oh,
please go ahead.
okay, I was just about to ask. So do you have like a favorite way to exploit a system, or is there like a first thing that you usually like to do or check?
That actually has evolved as computer security and exploits and software has evolved. But these days, usually my first three steps are run a vulnerability scanner over the system, check for Eternal Blue, which is an SMB exploit that was published a few years ago out of that big NSA leak, and check for Bluekeep, which is a remote desktop exploit that was published a few years ago. And since they were both published a few years ago, if a company has been up to date on their patching, that usually is a good sign if I can't find anything vulnerable to those, that they've been on top of their patching, that I'm going to have to get creative if I want to break anything. On the other hand, if they have at least one system with one of those vulnerabilities, it's very much an iterative process. Once you get onto one system, you can dump all the password hashes off of it and then crack those and then use those to get into other systems. Sometimes you don't even have to crack the hashes. Sometimes you can actually log into a different system with just the password hash.
Okay, so what kind of tools do you find yourself using on the job? You know, you've mentioned like some scanners, and but what kind of specific software do you usually find yourself using?
So I'm not above using random one-off tools for random one-off situations, but the three big ones that I find myself using over and over again are Nessus for the vulnerability scanner, Burp Suite as a web application vulnerability scanner specifically, and Metasploit Framework Professional Edition, although the Community Edition has a lot of features and is very useful if you can't afford a $25,000 a year license.
So what did is this are these is the software chosen at your own discretion, or like is it like a team thing? Do they recommend you use these things, or how do you go about choosing your software
It it's a team
or tool?
discussion. Every once in a while, we'll get together and we'll say, okay, I got a demo from this vendor. This tool looks really good. We should try a year's license for it. But most of us have experience with these three tools and have had good experiences with these three tools. So these are the ones that we keep using. But generally, the team will come to a decision on what tools to recommend we buy, run it by our supervisor, and he's usually, okay, as long as you can make a business case for it, we'll get it.
So being on the resume, because I had a very pressing question, you know, like I'm like, wow, I really want him to answer. I'd like to hear his answer to this. But have you ever had to put on like a funny disguise as a red teamer, break into the building, you know, just change into another suit, you know, be like, oh hey, you know, I'm an executive, kind of thing. Like, has that ever been part of like your responsibilities?
It is theoretically one of our responsibilities. We've never actually had a client that required it, but it has come up as a possibility on a few contracts that we've been bidding. And I'll be honest, I would love to just show up to a job like this.
Wow, you're wow, that's amazing. Okay, that's incredible. Okay. So do you back to that previous question, do you think that toolkit of, you know, those three software, do you think it's common across other companies as well?
So, to a different degree for each one. Nessus is one of the big names in vulnerability scanners, but it usually ends up being a case of use case versus who knows a guy in the company versus cost. A lot of people will go with Nexpose. Some people will go with Retina. If you're feeling really cheap, you might go with OpenVAS because that one's free. But Nessus is definitely one of the big names. It's not uncommon to see it in a lot of companies. Burp Suite, again, big name, not necessarily the only name. NetSparker is it's better at automated scanning. It's not quite as good at manual manipulation. So if you're in a corporate environment where you're automated scanning a whole bunch of different websites, it's more likely you run into NetSparker than Burp. But for something like what we do, that us, especially since web pen testing tends to involve a lot of manual attacks and checking, uh, Burp Suite actually does come up a lot in pen testing. And Metasploit is by far, in my experience, the most common pen testing exploit framework. The only other one that I've heard of that comes close is Core Impact, and I almost never hear of anybody using it.
Are you an advocate for any particular tool? Like, do you have like a bias or a favorite kind of thing? Just like, yeah, this should be the industry standard.
uh, I try not to. I prefer to be pragmatic. I like to use the best tool for the job, and admittedly, best tool can be somewhat subjective. It's partly based on what you're experienced with and what you're comfortable with. But if somebody said, I hate Nessus, you're not allowed to use it ever again, use Nexpose. I know how to use Nexpose. It would take me a few weeks maybe to get as comfortable with it as I am with Nessus, but I could make it work just as well as Nessus. It does very similar jobs. So if somebody asks me to recommend a tool, usually I ask them to clarify what they're going to be using it for. So Nexpose, the last time I checked with Nexpose, they have a setting where you can put it on as many different machines as you want in as many different locations as you want, but the license can only maintain data on so many IP addresses. And if you want more IP addresses than that, you either have to delete some old records or pay for a bigger license. So if you're doing an internal corporate scan where you have a set number of IPs that's not going to change, but maybe you need to move around to hit different isolated networks, that is better than Nessus, which is locked to a single machine, but you can scan whatever you want. As a pen tester, I have a pen testing virtual machine that has all the tools I use that's configured the way I like, that I can move around as I need, but I need to scan a lot of different systems for a lot of different clients. So Nessus works better for my personal use case.
Before I forget, so does anyone have any questions like from the audience before I continue asking more and more questions? Anybody?
Really
Oh,
quickly,
cool.
I had a question. So when in red teaming, do you guys actually write your own proof of concepts ever, or is it most of the time gonna be like using like Metasploit modules and stuff like that? Or what's like the breakdown of how much do you actually write your own proof of concepts versus using modules?
That is an excellent question. In practice, I spend very little of my time writing my own exploits. Most of what I do is using Metasploit modules or exploit DB modules. And the most I have to do usually is tweak a bit of code in an exploit I download to make it more applicable to my specific scenario. And this is not because I don't like writing my own exploits. This is not because I can't write my own exploits. This comes down to one of the biggest differences between a red team exercise and an actual malicious hack. An attacker, a malicious hacker, an APT ransomware group, they don't really have deadlines. They can spend 6 months trying to find an avenue of attack or writing a custom exploit for this one case. We are dealing with CISOs and CTOs and executives who want minimum impact to their systems while we're working, and to have an answer in hand without having to pay us an hourly wage for weeks or months on end. So sometimes, actually a lot of times, a red team will have to take some shortcuts that we kind of hand wave as, oh, if we had time, we could totally have done this ourselves, but you want this done in a week or in 2 weeks. So we're skipping the initial breach phase. We looked at your firewall's good. Let's say, what if somebody clicked on a spam link and now they have a foothold behind your firewall? And so we'll get a VPN account that puts us behind their firewall without having to actually get behind it ourselves, because getting behind it ourselves could take a month or two and they want it done in a week. So they give us a VPN account And we say, okay, now that there's an attacker behind your firewall, now what can we do?
I see. Thanks a lot. That's actually really, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. But I don't know if I said this on cameras. I think I mentioned it when I was talking about how I became a red teamer in the first place, but I did some time in a malware reverse engineering course, and I did the OSCP certification training, and part of that training is actually writing a simple buffer overflow exploit. So I've done exploit writing before. I've done malware writing and reverse engineering before. It's something that is actually very interesting and a lot of fun. And if you get the chance to do some hands-on work with it, I highly recommend it. It's just not something I get to do very often as part of my job because time constraints.
Okay, so back to the audience. Does anyone else have any questions before I ask a few of my own? Oh, okay. Okay, so my question was, we know how, cybersecurity, it just evolves all the time. Just it's more technology, patching, everything, people come up with new exploits. So how has your profession changed throughout the years, if at all, in the time that you've been doing it? When you think about it retrospectively.
So when I started, there were a lot more vulnerable network services, like actual servers that I could attack and compromise and use to take over a system. These days, between Windows Defender and the move towards web apps in general for everything, it's less about attacking the specific service and more about attacking the specific application. A lot of times, instead of dropping an exe on a system, I'll drop a PowerShell script. That's a lot easier to get by Windows Defender. Instead of compromising a streaming music server, I'll compromise the web page front end for the streaming music server. So there's been a big move away from individual network services and executables towards scripts and web apps.
So what kind of things do you find yourself learning right now?
Well, I'm brushing up a lot on my networking and binary hacking skills. So this came up before the recording started, and I'm sure Asher is very disappointed I haven't managed to bring it up in conversation yet. So let me bring it up now. I mentioned I have bachelor's degrees from UCSD. I got my master's from University of Illinois, and then I went into the workforce. About a year after I'd started at Viasat, I became aware that Viasat has a tuition reimbursement program. As long as I get B's or better in my classes, they will pay me $10,000 a year in tuition reimbursement, no questions asked. And I also became aware that as long as you are a half-time student or more at an accredited university, your student loans remain in deferment and you are not obligated to pay a single thin dime on them, although you should be paying down interest just as a matter of sanity, but you don't have to. So about a year after I started Viasat, I went back to school. I thought I'd ease myself into it. And since my technical skills were pretty sharp at the time and I wanted to take on more responsibility, I figured I'd go for an MBA. That would help me if I moved into any kind of leadership role. So I applied to Arkansas State University, which has the very nice property that if you can beat 600 on your GMAT, they don't ask for any other qualifications. You're automatically in. Your application is accepted. So I took the GMAT, got a 680, knocked out the MBA, thought, hey, this is kind of fun. This is kind of easy. What else can I do? And I thought, well, my pen testing skills are still pretty sharp, but I'd like to get more info on other aspects of cybersecurity. Let me go for digital forensics. So I applied to University of Maryland for a master's in digital forensics. Wrapped that up in May, and I decided I'd set my sights on, when I was originally going to school, when I went to UCSD, I thought 50-50 electrical engineering or computer science. And I did electrical engineering, and I don't regret it, but maybe it's time I actually officially picked up the computer science. So I applied to Arizona State's computer science master's program, And I'm running through their graduate level computer security course right now, which some of it is almost pathetically easy given my work experience. But some of it is actually stuff that I don't get a lot of chance to play with at work, like binary hacking or actually writing my own network tools. So I'm brushing up on that, and it's a lot of fun.
So does the audience have any questions about like his background, Mr. Michael? I have 6 degrees Rogers. Any pressing questions from the audience?
Oh, actually, I wanted to ask about like when you talk about binary hacking. Uh, we've seen like the move to ARM a lot with like Apple M1 chips and things like that. Do you see like the future like shifting farther away from x86 and more into like RISC-V5 risk RISC-V processors, or what do you think?
That's a very good question. And I definitely think ARM has a strong role to play and will become more important and more prevalent going forward. But I don't think we'll ever fully break away from x86. It's too ubiquitous and it's too ingrained in the laptop desktop market. And I don't think the laptop and desktop market will ever fully go away, however much we've been moving towards Chromebooks and services on in the cloud. I think we're at least 10 or 15 years away from having the global infrastructure to make putting everything in the cloud even remotely feasible. You spoiled college students may enjoy your on-campus internet, but out here in the wild, we have to deal with 20 megabits a second uphill both ways through the snow.
Yeah, it's not that good for us here right now anyways. They took our Ethernet away. That's so sad.
Ouch.
Uh, so I had a professor that made this offhand comment that, okay, so UCSC's network is pretty secure because it's never online, because you can't hack it if it's not online. I thought it was just the most hilarious thing. It's just within the lecture halls, it's, you know, sometimes internet's not up, like, oh, the professor has the notes. They didn't download it.
So let me ask a nostalgic question. Do you still have to use those stupid in-class iClicker things with the infrared to answer like in-class surveys and quizzes and things?
Not since we've gone online, but before then, we still had to do iClickers, and it, you know, you're just like, huh? Oh, okay, yeah, just click. Hopefully, it's not for points.
I mean, they're
Hopefully.
coming back, I think. I know people
So,
with iClicker classes this quarter too.
I think the statute of limitations has expired on this. I really hope so, because this is apparently going up on YouTube. But when I was at UCSD, I decided I'd stand out as an electrical engineering student. I took my iClicker and I opened the shell, and I realized it's basically a TV remote control with a few extra bells and whistles. It's basically a transmitter hooked up to an infrared LED. And basic electrical engineering, if you wire it in parallel, it draws more current, but the same voltage. So I hooked up I took off the infrared LED, ran a couple of wires, set up 3 LEDs in parallel, the same exact type of infrared LED, clustered them together, and I found that I never had to worry about getting my answer in when everybody else was buzzing in, because suddenly I had 3 times as bright an iClicker as anyone else. So I just blasted right through everyone else's submission.
Just, is that how it works? Wow, today I learned. So, I guess another question that I have is, like, so you started out with electrical engineering. Would you have changed it to something like computer science or maybe some other major like math or something else? Would you have done anything differently in terms of how you approached your education in your start?
My undergrad, no, not really. I did end up double majoring in math and electrical engineering. And if you're looking for a way to stand out, by the way, find a major that you can do easily that is fun for you, and you only need 10 unique courses per major, and everything else can count for both of them, or at least that's the way it was when I was there. So for 10 extra classes, you can get a second major. And that's a good way to both stand out on a resume and to pad your GPA if you pick your courses right. So as much as doing 2 degrees in 4 years kind of sucked, especially the 1 year I had to do 5 classes a quarter for 3 quarters straight, I don't really have any regrets for my undergrad. My master's at University of Illinois, I spent 5 years for what should have been a 3-year degree. I was having a lot of fun TAing. I wasn't really taking my research all that seriously, and in hindsight, I kind of wish I had. But I'm happy with where I am. I'm happy with how my career has turned out, and I'm happy with where my career is going. So I don't really have anything I really wish I could go back and change.
Okay, so do you have any kind of favorite educational resources to learn from?
I mean, apart from random universities that I'm just getting degrees from, this is going to sound kind of weird, maybe, but YouTube tutorials. So what I've noticed is that when you go to a school class, it takes time to update the curriculum based on what the latest in the field is. Unless you're taking like a cutting edge graduate seminar where the entire topic is latest advances in X. Usually the material you get is from at least 2 or 3 years ago, because overhauling an entire course takes a lot of time and effort. But people who write new tools, find new exploits, want to show off their skills in new technologies and new areas of cybersecurity, they'll just record a quick video and slap it on YouTube. Or maybe they'll monetize it and put together a course and toss it up on Coursera or Udemy. And those are both also very good resources. But in general, if I need to pick up just how to use a tool or a new technique very quickly, I'll spend 2 minutes searching on YouTube and I'll find 3 different tutorials.
Oh, okay. So does the audience have any additional questions? Okay, so my question. Okay, so my question would be, how would you personally describe your own skill set? And how does this differ from your teammates?
So, like I said, I came up through electrical engineering. A lot of my early experience was within the hardware software interface. I've done a lot of Verilog programming. I've done register-based addressing. I've done firmware work, embedded work. So when it comes to low-level systems programming, that's something I'm very good at. And as a result, I'm usually pretty good at the system level and network level exploits. That's what I tend to focus on as my role in a team of pen testers. Most pen testers will have at least some knowledge of most fields of pen testing, web apps, Windows, Linux, social engineering, but most of us tend to focus on 1 or 2, and mine is systems and networks mostly, although I can do social engineering, I can do web app. Other people on my team, we had a really good social engineer. I mean, like terrifyingly good. The one time we got a social engineering job, I helped her set up a portal, and that's literally all I helped her with. She managed the email campaign. She put polish on the web portal front end. She did the cold calling, and within a day, we had 18 different usernames and passwords and half a credit card. That literally, the guy just whipped out his credit card and started rattling off numbers, and she had to like halfway through scream, no, that's okay. That's enough for validation purposes, because we didn't want to like scam him out of PII over the phone. That was going a little bit far even for us.
Okay, so wait, how big is your team anyway? Like how many people do you normally work with?
So we have 3 people on our team, myself, James Hayen, and Andrew LaMarche. And between the 3 of us, we've got most topics covered. James is very good with industrial control systems and SCADA. Andrew is pretty good at web apps. We also have other people who we can pull on. So our social engineer worked in the SOC mostly, but she was always really happy to help with social engineering techniques. We might pull in a network engineer, a social engineer, a physical pen tester, just a lot of people on the cybersecurity side of things, not necessarily on the red team, have skills that can be used for red teaming, but it's either not what they want to do the most, or it's just not in their day-to-day job description. But they're usually happy to help us when we need an extra hand, and we're usually happy to help them if they need an extra hand.
Okay, so what kind of qualities do you believe a red teamer needs?
So this is like day one lecture from my pen testing class, because I do cover this. And one of the things I say is a pen tester needs to be able to hold two utterly contradictory mindsets at the same time. You need to be a creative, out-of-the-box, free thinker to get the exploits to work, to actually chain together unrelated vulnerabilities into total system compromise to make the magic happen. But as I mentioned before, your job isn't break the system. Your job is make sure nobody else can break the system. So you also have to be methodical, logical. You have to be able to write a good report. You have to make sure your results are reproducible. You have to keep track of everything, especially because your traffic will look like an attacker's traffic if you're doing your job right. That is the whole point, is you're mimicking an actual attacker. So if you get a call at 8 a.m. the next day from an IT security guy saying, hey, we noticed this weird behavior on the network, was that you need to either be able to point to your logs and say, yes, this was exactly what I was doing at that time, or you need to be able to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt, no, I wasn't even in your network at that time. You have an actual problem you should be addressing.
So before you had mentioned this about how you could do social engineering. Have you done any of these social engineering, and what was your technique? What was your tricks? What did you do?
So usually our social engineering ends up being a phishing campaign. We might also run cold calling, but phishing is generally the go-to. And which campaign approach we use is going to depend on the client and what they want to test and what the contract specifies, really. The one I was talking about earlier that got 18 hits in a day, we had access to the company intranet, so we knew what their branding looked like. We knew what their homepage looked like. So we recycled some of their assets and put together an employee raffle. Enter your network username and password to make sure everybody only gets one entry, of course, to win a free Apple Watch. And then we spammed that out to the entire company mailing directory from a marketing research company. And that was actually terrifyingly effective. One trick that we like is, so network printers are almost never secured. Sometimes you can steal documents out of a print queue or that have been stored from the scanner. But what's really fun is to access network printers and win a free trip to Disneyland for 2 flyer with a QR code on it that takes them to a phishing website. And then it just stays in the printer tray until the next morning when employees come in and they check the printer and go, hey, what's this flyer? Ooh, scan.
Did not know you could do that. That's crazy.
So see that face right there? Imagine that face, only the exact opposite, because it's now your job to make sure nobody else can do that. That's the expression I usually put on clients' faces.
Okay, so how would you go about making sure somebody wouldn't be able to do that?
Security training, security training, security training. Now, there are a lot of controls you can put in place to make sure that only authorized websites are accessible. If you've ever worked at a company for an internship, you've probably run into a company firewall. If you haven't, you're in for a treat. Because one of the topics that gets firewalled at Viasat is hacking tools and malicious software. And guess what kind of website I need to access daily for my job? So Usually once a month I have to call IT and say, hey, it's me. Yeah, it's the filter again. Yep. Hacking, malicious tools. Yeah, thanks. But security training and access controls for the internet are the two big ones. And that's actually one of the reasons we get asked to do social engineering, is not necessarily to use it to break into the network, but to test the effectiveness of security training. So instead of actually breaking in, we'll just have it go to a tracker that says, this employee clicked this link. This employee opened the email but did not click the link. This employee gets a gold star. He just forwarded it straight to IT security.
Okay, so what kind of measures do you find yourself taking to secure your own devices? Do you go so far as to, have like cryptographic hashes and everything, securing everything, having 10 layers of defense for just one document, like, what do you do?
So, first of all, I don't keep important information in a spreadsheet. I either memorize it or I have it on hard copy in a safe in my office. Second of all, if I have sensitive data that I need to protect, like the VM that I use for my pen testing, which usually has a fair amount of information on my clients, I use VeraCrypt, which lets you create basically a encrypted container on your drive. When you open it, it shows up as a secondary disk drive, and you can use it completely transparently. And when you're done, it just encrypts it and it goes away and it's protected. I make sure I use strong passwords. I make sure I don't reuse passwords. Anybody in the call a fan of XKCD? It's a
Yeah, they're
it's a
funny.
it's a very nerdy web comic, and there's a few cybersecurity topics in there that are very well known among the cybersecurity community. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It is very funny. But one of the comics that they did was on password strength. Specifically, through years of security training, we've gotten users to choose passwords that are very hard for people to remember and very easy for computers to guess. So what most people might do is troubadour with mixed upper and lowercase, and instead of an A, it's an ampersand, and instead of an E, it's a 3, and it's like leet speaking the single word, but it's actually surprisingly not that hard to guess that word. Whereas if you pick a password like correct horse battery staple, it's gibberish, but the very weirdness of it makes it really easy to remember. But guessing 4 dictionary words in a row is something that even computers have a hard time doing. So my recommendation for passwords is usually go for pass phrases. Find some obscure topic, preferably one that people who know you don't necessarily know you're interested in, and use that as long as there's at least 3 words per password, and maybe toss an exclamation point on the end, or swap out a 4 for an A, or something like that, but don't make it so that you can't remember it. That way you can pick lots of different unique, hard to guess passwords without having to write them down or use a password logger. Also, I remember seeing online something that I think was meant to be a joke, but it actually kind of resonated with me, which is something like, I work in IT, which means I have analog lights, analog windows, no smart home anything, a 10-year-old printer, and a gun next to the printer in case it ever makes a noise I don't like. So I am very much not a smart home person. The upper limit of smart home for me is I have my lights on a phone app, not even voice activated, just a phone app, so I can turn them on and off. And it's just my lights. And they're all LED bulbs. So the worst a hacker can do is annoy me at 3 in the morning or run up my power bill by $5.
I noticed you said something about like password loggers. Do you like not recommend like password managers like LastPass or something like that?
So it's not that I don't recommend them. Used properly, they can be very useful and very effective. The problem I keep running into with password managers is people will use a strong password generator, maybe 15, 20 randomly chosen characters that are impossible to guess, and also impossible to remember. And they'll use those on websites and apps and everything. But they'll store them in LastPass and then protect LastPass with their wife's name or their dog's name or their anniversary or some pathetically easy to crack password. So as long as you're using LastPass correctly, you're protecting it with a secure password of its own, by all means, go ahead and use it. I freely admit I do this myself because sometimes I don't want to think of a good password for something I'm only going to use once or twice, so I use a randomly generated password that I can never remember. So I use LastPass for that. But again, defense in depth. Assume somebody is able to get into your network. Assume maybe you invite a friend over to help work on a project and his computer has a Trojan and now his Trojan is in your network. What you gonna do? Well, as long as you've got a secure password on your LastPass, that's one less thing for you to worry about.
Okay, so do you have any kind of recommendations for how to get your hands wet with red teaming practices? Like, how would you get your start? Like, is there some kind of environment you can play with or some kind of tool you could play with for someone that might want to get into red teaming for the first time?
Absolutely. So Metasploit actually has a website called Metasploit Unleashed, which is, I think, part of the offensive security domain, where they basically run you through a whole bunch of tutorials on how to use Metasploit. So if you want to really get your hands wet with red teaming, the first thing I would do is spin up a couple of virtual machines. VirtualBox is free, lets you do multiple VMs at once. I'm not sure if you get VMware Workstation through your student store or not. If you do, Workstation is also a very good program. Create a Kali virtual machine. There are known vulnerable training VM images out there like Metasploitable that you can download and set up as a second VM and then work through Metasploit Unleashed or work through various tutorials and start getting practice with Metasploit. There are a whole bunch of free online hacking things like Hack the Box that you can literally just log into and sharpen your pen testing skills on. VulnHub is good for downloading like hacking-based capture the flag VM images that you can practice on.
So how much like prerequisite knowledge do you think would be kind of like required to just start using those tools?
If you're in computer science or engineering, you probably already have most of the skills you're going to need. Linux command line is a big one. Be comfortable with virtual machines, know some networking. But in general, if you follow a good tutorial, you won't find yourself too far out of your depth. And even if you do, Google whatever topic you're having a hard time with and you can pick it up from there.
Are you a part of any kind of like online communities for like red teaming or cybersecurity?
Not specifically. Most of what I do to be in with the community is teach at Cal State San Marcos, and that's not so much me being part of the community as me passing on my skills to the next generation.
So how do you get your news or, you know, things about the like latest exploits and things you need to watch out for? Like, how do you keep up to date?
So for a while, I was just going through various tech blogs, Reddit, dark reading, and then Viasat did something very nice. They actually have a InfoSec newsfeed Slack channel with a bot that just scrapes the top security blogs and messages me with all of the latest headlines. So I usually read through that once or twice a day and follow up on any articles that look interesting or useful.
What's a recent exploit that you thought was really interesting?
I mean, that one's kind of obvious. Log4j, of course. So for those who haven't heard of it, Log4j is a module for logging that is used by web servers, especially Apache web server. And there is a flaw in it where if you pass it a URL, it will actually download and execute code from that URL. So pretty much anybody running a stock Apache server was vulnerable to a remote code execution exploit. That one brought down the sky. That one caused a Chicken Little level, the sky is falling panic with just about everyone, because Apache is like the most ubiquitous, everybody uses it web server.
So have you ever found yourself hacking or trying to hack your either your relatives or people you know, and just saying, hey, you know, you probably want to watch out here, like just like off the job?
Not really. Partly because even if it is family, hacking a system that you are not explicitly authorized to hack is very, very illegal. And it's not a habit I want to get into, even if my family would probably be cool with it. The closest I've ever come to that is when I visit relatives and they go, oh, I'm sure I have the Wi-Fi password written down somewhere. Let me go check. And I'll just bust out like Reaver, or I'll go on their computer for 5 minutes and guess the default password for the Wi-Fi router, which usually lets me in, and just get the Wi-Fi password that way while they're still looking for the scrap of paper they wrote it down on 5 years ago.
So do you have any advice for people wanting to get into like pen testing or red teaming?
So for people who want to get into it as a hobby or as a topic to study while they're still in school, like I said, tutorials online, spin up some VMs, play around. Your school may have a cybersecurity organization. University of Illinois has SIG Pony, of all things. And involving yourself in that, if there is one at UCSD, would be good. If not, maybe start one. That would look amazing on a resume. Started cybersecurity organization at school. If you're looking to get into it as a job, when I interview people for the red team, usually I'm looking more for the mindset than the skill set. I want to see things like spun up a home pen testing lab with virtual machines and experimented, or attended extracurricular organizations for security, or did this capture the flag, or things that show that you're passionate about cybersecurity. It's easy to train a skill set. I don't mind if I have to spend 3 months or 6 months running you through tutorials on the specific tools we use. What I want to see is, do you have the creativity? Do you have the passion? Is this something that you actually want to be doing and that you have some experience at playing around with?
On that note, what do you think about CTFs as like practice or like experience in this kind of field?
That depends kind of on the type of CTF. In general, I think it's a great thing to practice your skills on. I highly recommend them. But some CTFs are more useful than others. There was a satellite hacking based CTF a few months ago that a lot of us at Viasat were interested in, because Viasat Red Team, we do satellites, we do hacking. That seems like it's tailor made for us, right? Well, the qualifier was something like, analyze this image of a star field and using a Python script, tell me where exactly the satellite is located. It's like,
Oh yeah,
okay,
I had to do so much learning physics for that.
yeah, it's like, okay, I spent the last 10 years breaking into computers, not doing astrophysics. This is a little unfair. So I'm not going to say all CTFs are good practice for cybersecurity, but most of them, in my experience, are at least good for sharpening your skills and showing off what you can do.
Yeah, I remember on that one specifically, Hackaset, I spent like a full like 7 hours one night just trying to figure out what a quaternion was. And that's when I knew this CTF was just not it for me.
Yeah, see, that's what I'm talking about. On the one hand, if you had gone through that CTF and succeeded from start to finish, that practically would have guaranteed you a slot on our team. On the other hand, the fact that you probably didn't based on what you've been saying, we're not going to hold that against you because none of the people actually on the team got through it either.
So were you planning on going back for a degree in astrophysics as well, you know, to address that, just to make sure, you know, you have all your bases covered?
I mean, I've toyed with the idea. I've also toyed with nuclear physics just for the sheer terror factor. But right now, my current plan is to finish up the master's in computer science, then go for a PhD in cybersecurity or information assurance, then probably a JD or jurisprudence doctorate and go in and get a law degree.
So what makes you interested in getting a potentially a law degree?
Partly the challenge, partly the intimidation factor. I mean, who wants to mess with the guy who can break into who has the degree to break into your computer, the degree to arrange it forensically to his precise specifications, and then the degree to prosecute you in court for the stuff that is absolutely on your computer now? Not, of course, that I would ever do anything immoral or illegal like that, but there's the implication.
But just, you know, the thought, you know, it's just like, okay, it's if 6 or 7 degrees, you're a certified badass. that kind of like feeling, right?
Yeah. It's like I'm a pen testing forensic lawyer. I have more degree initials after my name than are in my name. How sure are you want to keep messing with me?
Well, so does anyone else have any more questions? Because I somewhat ran out of my questions. And Rahil or maybe Vincent?
Actually, I got one more question. Is So I know you talked about the OSCP, the certification earlier. Are there any other certifications that you think are useful, even if not in red teaming, just in general? And how like valuable do you think certifications are themselves?
So, to answer the second part of the question first, certifications, some of them can be extremely valuable, some of them are less so. It really depends on what certifications you're going for and what field you're working in. The OSCP is one of the hardest to get and most respected pen testing certs you can get. If you don't want to jump in on the deep end, if you want to work your way up, the order goes Security Plus for beginners. It's not very impressive on a resume, but if you're just starting out and you want to see how certs kind of work and what you need to know, Security Plus is a very safe beginning cert to get. If you feel confident in your technical skills, CEH is a good intermediate cert and is respected by a fair number of places. Not as much for red teaming as the OSCP, but it is a good cert to have. OSCP is generally very respected by people who know about pen testing certs. If you're going into cybersecurity in general, not necessarily specifically red teaming, if you're looking at more of a managerial or blue team or CISO role, CISSP is a good cert for managers and aspiring managers, but you need a few years of industry experience before you're allowed to go for it. Still, you can look at what's involved in getting it and maybe study up on it a little bit here and there while you're building up the necessary experience. And then there's dozens upon dozens of certs that are offered for various topics. Like I have a mobile app and web app pen testing cert that I got a couple of years ago for a 1-week course and a multiple choice test. It's not something I brag about. It's not a very well-known cert. But it does look good if we're bidding on a contract and we say, okay, our pen test team has Mr. Degree Badass over here, and our pen test team has the following certs between them, and one of them is we're certified for mobile application and web app pen testing. Do you know exactly what goes into that? No, but we have a mobile app. Maybe we want a pen test team that has mobile app certs. My big advice for certifications is maybe get 1 or 2 good certs like CEH before you start applying for jobs, because it does look good on a resume to have that cert going in. But jobs in general, and not just Viasat, although Viasat is very, very good about it, most jobs will offer some kind of training budget to help you build up your skills or keep them sharp. And a lot of certs cost money. The OSCP, if you want a full 30 days of lab, costs hundreds of dollars, like $600 or $700. After you've been in the field for a while, that's not a hugely painful amount of money. But I remember being an undergrad. If somebody told me as an undergrad, get this cert, it'll guarantee you a job, how much does it cost? $700. I would have had to spend a few nights thinking about that. So don't necessarily worry too much about certs now. Any good employer is going to help you get them once you've gotten the job. Maybe focus on 1 or 2 to pad your resume if you think it needs it. But beyond that, certs are good to have, but they're also something your employer should be helping you get.
So it's interesting that you say, oh, okay, not sure about $700 for a guaranteed job, because like we're here paying some students over 100,000 for maybe getting a job. So it's funny that you mentioned that.
Well, there's taking out a loan is one thing. It doesn't have the same immediate effect as watching $700 get hoovered out of your bank account immediately.
Okay.
And believe me, I know both of those feelings depressingly well.
Okay. And so any additional questions? Otherwise, I may be cutting today's panel a little short. Though I still would like to speak afterward, but any more questions, Rahel, Vincent, for the recording?
One from me, no.
Any last words, Michael, for the potential YouTube video?
One of the things I put in one of my beginning lectures for my pen testing class is, those of you about to enter the job market, watch a lot of 80s and 90s movies and TV shows if you can, because all of the references your interviewers are going to make are likely going to be from that era. And if you get them, your interviewer will love you forever.
Which movies? What's a good movie to start with?
So in general terms, I'm a big fan of Back to School with Rodney Dangerfield. It's a very funny comedic movie featuring a guest star, I guess would be the best way to say it, by a very, very young Tony Stark. Robert Downey Jr., that's his name. Very young Robert Downey Jr. For hacking and red teaming specifically, Hackers, the original movie Hackers. A lot of what goes on in there is complete Hollywood hacking bull, but some of the social engineering and physical pen testing they do is actually legit, and it has a whole bunch of good lines you can reference to really impress an interviewer.
I guess I have one more question. So have you met any like super insane hacker where you're just like, I don't know how this person exists? Have you ever met someone like that?
I haven't personally had the pleasure, but one of my coworkers did get face-to-face with David Kennedy. And if you've done any kind of research into the hacking scene, David Kennedy is like the name in hacking and offensive security. He has like keynotes at DEF CON and Black Hat all the time. And his legend is to the point where knowing somebody who talked to David Kennedy directly was an honor for me.
Okay, I think that will be about it. I will stop the recording, and I was thinking, okay, maybe we'll just talk a little bit about UCSC. I want to hear about your time back then, because I don't think that's too much too related.